We talked about anxiety being a normal and valuable experience in a fallen world. You need it to protect you against danger and hopefully have good responses that keep you safe. Secondly, some people are more prone to anxiety than others, temperamentally, genetically, through life experience. Some get very anxious, some feel very little anxiety at all. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. Then you could be anxious, so Scripture tells us, and here we begin to get into biblical principles, about the wrong things. And this exposes what your real values are. If you've put too much value in your possessions, says Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, then you'll probably be anxious. And if so this exposes, in a way, the idols of your life. You could deal with anxiety in the wrong way. In other words, losing perspective, losing trust in God that He really is in control, and you trying to be in control of your universe yourself instead of letting Him be. And we need to learn to bring our anxieties to the one who is in ultimate control and loves us. And we looked at some examples from the Psalms, from the life of Paul, from Jesus, all of whom experienced anxiety and dealt with it in particular ways. So like in 1 Peter 5:7. And then we began in the way through this to look at some common grace, what I call common grace remedies. So there's a lot in Scripture about anxiety, isn't there, and trusting God and so on. But some of us experience extreme forms of anxiety. And there are a lot of useful, what I call, like we have medicine for other diseases in life, they're not described in Scripture. We call those common grace remedies for the gifts of God that have been discovered quite often by non-Christians that we can use to help us when we get particularly anxious. And the typical forms that we experience beyond the sort of more general level of anxiety that we all have about life and war and politics and economics and sort of safety of our children and all that sort of thing. Some people experience panic attacks. So those of you who've done psychology will know a little bit about this. Some of you, I bet some of you in this room actually have had panic attacks. And this is the way we describe them. Don't try and copy all this down. I think you'll just be writing the whole time. But we usually describe a panic attack as a discrete period of intense fear or discomfort in which at least 4 of these symptoms develop abruptly and reach a peak within a few minutes. So you might feel in this that you're going to die. You have palpitations, you're sweating, you feel like you're choking, you might have chest pain, you might be dizzy, you might be short of breath, have tingling in your fingers and toes, and either you think you're going to die or you think you're going to go crazy. That's a pretty typical panic attack. And then some people develop a real fear that they are going to, once they've had one, then they develop a secondary fear, which is a fear of fear, a phobia about having a panic attack and if it's happened in a public place like a church or in a shopping mall, a store somewhere, then they will begin to have a fear of going out to that place or a fear of being around people in case they have it again. And that we call agoraphobia, the third one here. So phobias are intense fear of an object, activity, or situation that's out of proportion to the object that caused it. So most of us know when we have it and we hate it. So you might have a fear of flying or a fear of going in elevators, lifts. You might have there are all sorts of different fears, hundreds of different fears that are named, most bizarre fears, the typical sort of fear of snakes or public speaking. And then some people have a fear or a social phobia of just being with other people. So they get very anxious when they're around groups of people. And all of us try to, when you get afraid, you want to take away the fear so you avoid those situations as much as possible. So it becomes a life of fear and avoidance in relation to those things. And we'll come back to talk about how we can help people with this in a moment. Then we talk about generalized anxiety disorder, which is just excessive, sort of pervasive, chronic, lasting for more than a day or weeks, but lasting for at least 6 months, and not particularly associated with any object or situation. So you just know that you're just anxious all the time, and it's not about any one thing. And then obsessive compulsive disorder, typically OCD, and here you have obsessions or compulsions. So you usually have a belief, for example. The obsession would be the typical one is if I touch certain things or allow them to touch me, I'm going to get some awful disease and I'll probably die. So what you do, you spend your day washing. Some people wash their hands 100 times. You're afraid the house is going to be broken into, and you leave the house and you have to go back and check the door again and again and again. Some people extreme ways. So there are some very bizarre obsessive rituals that people get into. It's a very crippling thing. I had one client who, every time he had his quiet time, he would read the letter S, and he would think sex, and then he would think Satan. And then he realized that he'd sinned, and he had to go through a complex ritual of asking God's forgiveness, which interfered completely with any prayer or reading of Scripture. So sometimes you just have obsessions, sometimes you have compulsions. John Bunyan had an obsessive fear that he was going to blaspheme in the pulpit. It just went round and round in his head every time he went towards the pulpit. It lasted several years. And then the last one of these more extremes is what we've all become familiar with in a world of war and battle and soldiers coming back from the battlefield and 9/11s and people migrating out of war-torn areas of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a reaction to a psychologically traumatic event. Now, we all would get traumatized by something like that. Most of us would be shaking, would be nervous, anxious, have flashbacks. But when it lasts for more than a month and continues on, then we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And so you may re-experience in flashbacks what you went through. Maybe it was a bomb explosion, maybe it was a rape, maybe it was a house burning down. And then you avoid. You avoid anything that reminds you of that. We had a friend who was mugged in a street near our home. She couldn't go down that street. Walking in the street made her very nervous. Her whole body was heightened, this last point, what we call hypervigilance, heightened physiological arousal, sort of ready to fight or to run. And then there is also, often people are depressed, they have difficulty with relationships, they use alcohol and drugs to dull the pain and to numb themselves in this. So this causes, and here we get into a little bit of an explanation and some of the common grace remedies, because the Bible gives us general principles about anxiety. It doesn't directly address phobias and PTSD and OCD. These are more extreme examples of living in a fallen world where your brain is broken by the fall, by bombs going off or whatever it is. So what typically happens is a disintegration of brain function at both a vertical and a horizontal level. Let me explain that a little bit. So we have, and this is a bit of a caricature, it's not quite as simple as this, but right and left brain, And the left brain typically is the logical language, lots of L's here, literal, the thing that where we remember events and can describe them and tell a story about them. It's an outward focus. The right brain is more the emotional imagination side of our brain, the non-verbal, the experiential, the inward focus. So that when something really shocking happens to you, it's almost like it's experienced in your right brain and you get flashbacks from the right brain, but the left brain has blocked it out because it was so terrifying, and you can't exactly remember in detail the story because every time you do, you begin to get incredibly anxious. So that would be the horizontal split. And then the vertical is more, you have your higher cortex with all its sophisticated functions of memory and emotions, especially in the frontal lobes here. And then you have your midbrain functions with the amygdala there in the center being the sort of smoke detector or alarm detector in the brain. And then the signals go from that around the hippocampus and into the rest of the brain. So when some people have very hypersensitive amygdalas, you know, their smoke detector, and after you've been living in a war situation or you've had something terrible happen to you, it's likely your amygdala is going to be on alert for quite a while until it gradually dies down again. And then your hindbrain, or the lower parts of your brain here, are the sort of basic functions that control breathing and eating and sex and things like that. So there may be a cutoff. Your amygdala may go on alarm, and then the signals will not necessarily go through the full range of cortical functions before your body reacts. So there's a little bit of there's both a horizontal and a vertical disintegration. So PTSD is most common and most powerful when there has been threat to your life with no chance of escape. You can't fight, you can't flee, so you freeze. And it's almost like your brain goes into freeze mode. So when someone's trapped in a burning vehicle, horrific thought, that their brain almost is protecting them from the horror of this and sort of going into freeze mode. So the amygdala prompts the release of adrenaline, and you tend to have this enhanced, what we call implicit, or the emotional memory. The deeper sort of structures of memory, the memory that you have when you learn to ride a bike and it never goes away from you. It's just built into you. But it's also a deeply emotional memory. And you dissociate and detach from the horror of what's going on around you in order to survive. So people describe sort of out-of-the-body experiences when they're being raped or someone's attacking them. They're dissociating from the reality of it. So you can't fight or flee, you freeze. And this, as I mentioned earlier, the explicit memory, the literal description of what's happening, tends to get blocked. So the implicit memories, the flashbacks come in and they intrude when you're walking down the street after you've been mugged and you hear someone walking up behind you, and that immediately triggers the alarm, and you may have a flashback of what happened. Or someone may, you've been in a war zone and a guy comes back from there and his wife just shakes his shoulder gently to wake him up to go to work, and he has a full-scale alarm reaction and jumps out of bed and almost strangles her. But at the same time, so these are the flashback moments, but also there is the avoidance and the numbing. So numbing yourself with, as I mentioned, with alcohol, drugs, depression, cutting off from other people, That's a common reaction in this. Now, some people are much more resilient than others in the face of trauma. And we don't fully understand why, but a lot of it is to do with the resources of security that you have grown up with. If you've grown up with a basic sense of security, if you haven't suffered too many traumatic, really bad traumatic things in your past, if you're part of a good community, that's a really important part of helping people to be resilient. And obviously, if you are a person of faith and trust, you have something bigger that you can trust in other than yourself, all of those things will help to promote resilience. Now, there are many therapies to help with this. And people are experimenting all over the place with how do we help people to get past this. And a deep part of this is helping people to be able to verbalize the story of what happened to them while they're in a place where they're not getting too over-alarmed. So to help them to feel safe and be able to tell their story and feel some of the experience of it, but not to the extreme that triggers. So we talk about being in a window of tolerance. So when a therapist is working with someone, they try and keep them by keeping them grounded in reality, not letting them dissociate and wander off in their heads, not exposing them too quickly. And one form of doing that, which we can talk about a little more in the Q&A time if you want, is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. It sounds sort of magical, and it feels a bit magical, but it's basically helping people to tell their stories while stimulating alternately both sides of the brain. So it's a bilateral stimulation, either getting them to move their eyes back and forth, following a finger, or a buzzer in one hand to the other hand, and it goes buzz, buzz, buzz like this, or sounds. And while they're telling it and sort of reprocessing the story, while this is happening, it seems to speed up the process of reintegration of the two halves of the brain. We don't fully understand why, and it feels sort of miraculous, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that it works. A lot of therapists are using it. Then there's cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'll describe that in the second half. Mindfulness skills. Now, this isn't Eastern mysticism. There is a really good use for basic mindfulness skills. It has come to us out of a Buddhist tradition, but like yoga, you can get the benefits of the physical exercises of yoga without taking on Hinduism. So with mindfulness, you can get some of the benefits of basic calming, learning to calm, still yourself, learning ways of breathing and self-awareness that are actually helpful in getting over more extreme forms of anxiety, especially PTSD. I mentioned yoga. That's been found by many people to be helpful. Dance therapy, music therapy, martial arts. It's really interesting how all of these sort of things that involve not only talking about, but engaging the body. So someone who has been trapped by a rapist or a mugger or something, who then learns martial arts, feels a whole lot stronger and able to defend themselves in the future. But you may have to train them to actually exercise their strength by pushing against a wall. And they learn that they can resist bad things. Now, obviously, there are ways of dealing with dangerous attacks that are unwise. But just there's a whole range of therapies that can be really helpful.